The notification didn't just buzz, it stabbed. $0. That was the balance in my little account, the one they laughed about, the one they said I used for cute side projects. And I remember standing in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, turkey still half-seasoned, rosemary clinging to my fingers, staring at my phone while my sister's laughter floated in from the living room. They thought I didn't hear them the night before. "Don't worry," my brother-in-law had said. "She's got that tiny savings thing. It's basically her hobby account." A hobby. I had built it brick by brick, quietly, carefully, strategically, and now it was empty, completely emptied. Every dollar gone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had been underestimated. So many of you wrote about siblings who smiled in your face while secretly calculating your worth, about partners who called your ambition cute, about family who only respected numbers when they were big enough to intimidate them. I thought I was immune to that kind of betrayal. I was wrong. Thanksgiving has always been our family's theater stage. Perfect smiles, perfect casseroles, perfect illusions. And I played my role well. Successful, but not flashy. Wealthy, but discreet. Strategic, but soft-spoken. Because in my family, if you shine too brightly, someone tries to dim you. My little account wasn't little. It was a layered shell corporation attached to 3 international holding structures. It was liquidity management designed for quiet mobility. It was the testing ground for my next acquisition. But to them, it was adorable. And that misunderstanding was intentional. The night before Thanksgiving, we were gathered around my mother's dining table, candles flickering, wine flowing, the usual subtle interrogation disguised as conversation. "So," my sister asked sweetly, "how's the little online thing going?" Online thing. I smiled, growing. "How much could that even make?" my brother-in-law laughed. "Enough for what, a vacation?" I let them underestimate me. I let them think my wealth lived in one visible account. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 7 years building something my father once said women in this family weren't wired for: control. And control is quiet, but betrayal is loud. The notification came at 6:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because the sky was still gray, the house still asleep, and my heart had just started racing for no reason I could explain. Unauthorized transfer, followed by another, followed by a complete sweep. The account they joked about, the account only 2 people had ever had temporary access to during a liquidity restructure, my sister and her husband. The access was supposed to last 48 hours during a tax bridge strategy 2 months prior. It had been revoked, or so I thought. When I opened the back-end panel of my banking dashboard, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The access key had been regenerated from inside the family Wi-Fi, the same Wi-Fi I was standing under. The turkey timer beeped. Life kept moving. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into the living room. I didn't accuse. Because real power doesn't react emotionally. It gathers evidence. I quietly walked to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and opened my laptop. By 6:32 a.m., I'd already contacted my private compliance officer. By 6:40, forensics tracing had begun. By 6:52, I knew something that changed everything. The money hadn't been moved to an offshore account. It had been consolidated into a joint investment vehicle recently opened in their names, using leverage they clearly didn't understand. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd unknowingly triggered a trap, because what they thought was my little account was the bait layer, the visible layer, the part of the empire designed to detect internal threats. And here's the part that still makes my chest tighten when I say it out loud. They didn't steal from me because they needed money. They stole because they thought I wouldn't notice, because in their minds, I wasn't capable of building something worth protecting. That hurt more than the numbers. At 8 a.m., we all sat at the breakfast table. Cinnamon rolls, forced smiles. My sister poured coffee like nothing had happened. Her husband avoided eye contact. And my phone vibrated again. A message from my compliance officer. We've identified secondary exposure. If you move now, it will be irreversible. Irreversible. I looked up at my sister. She smiled. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. They didn't just think I was small. They thought I was powerless. And they had no idea what I was about to do. I didn't answer the compliance officer right away. Irreversible. That word echoed in my head while my mother passed the butter like this was just another cozy Thanksgiving morning, like nothing seismic had just shifted under the surface of our family. I kept my face neutral. Because here's what people misunderstand about power. It doesn't explode, it calculates. I excused myself after breakfast and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cold, sharp enough to clear my thoughts. My phone screen glowed against the gray sky. Explained secondary exposure, I typed. The reply came almost instantly. They used the transferred funds as collateral, leveraged at 4-to-1. If margin calls hit, liability traces back through the originating asset trail. Originating asset trail. Me. They hadn't just stolen my liquidity, they had tied my name to a leveraged instrument that could implode publicly if it collapsed. And suddenly the insult felt strategic. This wasn't just about taking money, it was about testing how far they could go. Let me rewind for a moment. 2 months earlier, my sister had come to me crying. Not dramatic tears, not manipulation, real, quiet fear. Her husband's startup was struggling, cash flow was unstable, investors were nervous. "I don't want to ask you this," she'd said, voice trembling, "but could we temporarily park some funds in a joint structure just to show stability on paper?" I knew it was risky. I knew mixing family and capital was a line you don't cross. But she's my sister, and I thought blood meant something. So I structured a temporary access window, limited permissions, monitored entry points, a 48-hour window to display liquidity proof during negotiations. It was supposed to close automatically, and according to the logs, it had, until someone regenerated access from inside this house. Back on the porch, I exhaled slowly. "Can we reverse?" I texted. There was a pause this time. Then, "Yes, but if we trigger recovery, their leveraged position collapses immediately, publicly. There will be legal consequences." I stared at the yard where we used to play as kids, where my sister and I built pretend businesses out of lemonade stands and cardboard signs. Public consequences, legal consequences, family consequences. And then I remembered the laughter at the dinner table, her cute little account. The dismissiveness, the assumption, they didn't think I'd fight back. Inside, my brother-in-law was carving turkey like a king, distributing portions to his kingdom. He looked comfortable, confident. I wondered if he even understood what 4-to-1 leverage meant, if he knew that a 3% shift in the wrong direction could wipe them out, or if he assumed I'd just absorbed the hit quietly to avoid embarrassment. That's the thing about underestimating someone. You project your own limits onto them. By noon, extended family had arrived. Noise filled the house. Football played in the background. Glasses clinked. I watched my sister laugh with our cousins. No guilt in her eyes, no hesitation. And that hurt more than anything. Because betrayal is easier to process when it comes from an enemy. From family, it fractures something deeper. My phone buzzed again. Market volatility alert. The leveraged instrument they'd tied my funds to had begun fluctuating. The compliance officer sent a brief message. They're exposed. If you wait too long, systemic damage risk increases. Systemic damage. Not just to them, to my broader holdings. They had unknowingly connected themselves to a pressure-sensitive node in my network. I had designed that account years ago as a stress test environment, a controlled risk sandbox. Any internal breach would trigger traceable escalation. They thought they were siphoning from a shallow pool. They were standing on a fault line. At 2:17 p.m., I made my decision, not emotionally, strategically. I typed 2 words: execute recovery. My thumb hovered over send for a fraction of a second. Then I pressed it, and the machine moved. The collapse didn't happen instantly. It rippled. First, their joint vehicle froze. Then their brokerage flagged abnormal collateral withdrawal. Then the leverage ratio breached safety parameters. I watched the live dashboard from the upstairs hallway while laughter drifted from below. Numbers don't scream, but they tell the truth. By 2:43 p.m., margin calls were triggered. By 2:49 p.m., automated liquidation protocols began. By 2:52 p.m., my brother-in-law's phone rang. I heard it from downstairs. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and stepped into the kitchen. I followed slowly, pretending to refill my drink. His voice dropped. "What do you mean, insufficient coverage?" Pause. "No, that's not possible. The funds were—" He stopped talking. His eyes lifted, and for the first time that day, they locked on mine. Recognition flickered, not full understanding yet, but suspicion. My sister joined him in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" she whispered. He turned away from me, hand covering the phone. "Something's wrong with the investment account." Investment account. Interesting choice of words. Another pause. Then his face went pale. "They're liquidating." My sister's head snapped toward him. "Liquidating what?" He swallowed. "Everything." Silence hit the kitchen like a vacuum. In the living room, someone cheered at the football game. The contrast felt surreal. My sister's breathing quickened. "That's not possible. We just moved—" She stopped mid-sentence because she saw my expression. Calm, steady, unshaken. Understanding dawned slowly in her eyes. "You knew," she said. Not loud, not accusatory, just stunned. I tilted my head slightly. "I always know," I replied quietly. He hung up the phone. "What did you do?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice low. "I protected my assets," I said evenly. "You gave us access." "For 48 hours, 2 months ago." My sister's voice cracked. "It was just temporary." "You regenerated the key from this house." Her face drained of color. He stepped forward. "You set us up." There it was, the reversal, victims accusing the boundary holder. I held his gaze. "No," I said. "I set up protection. You chose to test it." My phone buzzed again. Recovery confirmed. Primary funds restored. Secondary exposure neutralized. And then one final message. Their personal liability now exceeds their initial extraction by 380%. They hadn't just lost what they took, they owed, significantly. My sister grabbed the counter to steady herself. "This will ruin us," she whispered. I studied her face, the same face that once begged me for help, the same voice that called my empire little. Ruin. Such a dramatic word. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only they could hear. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said softly. "You thought I was small." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief second I almost softened. Almost. But then I remembered standing alone in the bathroom at 6:17 a.m., staring at $0 and 0 cents, feeling disposable. From the living room, my mother called out, "Dinner's ready." Life moving forward, oblivious. But in this kitchen, something irreversible had just happened. He looked at me again, anger masking panic. "This isn't over," he said, and I believed him, because people who lose control rarely walk away quietly. I turned and walked back toward the dining room, every step steady. Behind me, I heard my sister whisper something I couldn't quite catch, except the last two words. She planned. No, I didn't plan their betrayal, but I had prepared for it. And as we all took our seats around the Thanksgiving table, passing plates and pretending everything was normal, I knew the real fallout hadn't even begun. Because what they didn't realize yet was that the liquidation had triggered an automatic audit, and that audit was about to uncover something far bigger than a little account. The audit notice hit their inboxes at 3:12 p.m. I know the exact time because my dashboard mirrored every triggered compliance cascade connected to that vehicle. When the liquidation breached a certain threshold, it automatically flagged associated entities for review. Associated entities. Their startup, their joint holdings, their personal guarantees. And because they had tied everything together in a rushed attempt to amplify stolen collateral, the system now saw their entire financial world as one tangled thread. They didn't understand that when you pull on a thread inside my architecture, you don't just unravel one stitch, you expose the pattern. Dinner was served family style. Turkey carved, sweet potatoes glistening, cranberry sauce shaped perfectly like the can it came from. My mother raised her glass. "To family," she smiled warmly, "no matter what." I almost laughed. Across the table, my sister hadn't touched her food. Her husband kept checking his phone under the table, thinking no one noticed. But I noticed everything. A new email notification flashed on his screen. I caught the subject line reflected faintly in his glasses. Formal notice of review. His jaw tightened. He excused himself. I waited exactly 30 seconds before following. He was in the hallway near the coat closet, whispering furiously into his phone. "Yes, I see the audit notice." Pause. "No, it wasn't supposed to trigger that." Longer pause. "I don't care what the compliance model says. Fix it." "Fix it." I leaned casually against the wall. "You can't fix an automated governance structure," I said calmly. He froze, slowly turned. "You did this." I protected myself. "You're destroying us over money." There it was again, reducing it to money. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No," I said quietly. "You tried to reduce me to someone who wouldn't fight back." Let me explain something important. The little account wasn't my wealth. It was my firewall. It was designed to detect internal threats because external enemies are predictable. Regulators follow rules. Competitors follow market logic. Family? They operate on entitlement, and entitlement is harder to hedge against. So I built a mechanism that would quietly escalate if anyone exploited access privileges beyond authorized windows. It didn't just retrieve funds, it examined intent, patterns, connections, and what it was finding right now was not flattering. Back at the table, my sister's hands were trembling. My mother noticed. "Sweetheart, are you feeling okay?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," she lied. I watched the cracks widen because betrayal doesn't just fracture trust, it fractures composure. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, and the blood drained from her face completely this time. "What?" my mother asked. My sister looked at me instead of answering. "You didn't have to do this." "Do what? Expose truth? Activate consequences? Protect myself?" Interesting how accountability always feels excessive when you're the one being held to it. Her husband returned, face pale but trying to maintain control. "We need to leave," he said abruptly. "So soon?" my aunt asked, confused. "Emergency," he muttered. My mother stood. "Is everything okay?" Silence. The room held its breath. And then my sister did something I didn't expect. She looked at everyone, at the entire table, and she said, "We made a mistake." Not the full truth, but a crack in the performance. Her husband shot her a warning look. She ignored it. "We accessed something we shouldn't have," she whispered. The room shifted from confusion to tension instantly. My father frowned. "What kind of access?" he asked. My brother-in-law stepped in quickly. "It's a misunderstanding." "No," she whispered, "it's not." And for the first time all day, I saw something real in her eyes. Fear. Not of losing money, but of losing image. "I trusted you," she said to me. The audacity almost stunned me. "You trusted me?" I repeated softly. "You gave us that account for 48 hours. You never said it was some kind of trap." "It wasn't a trap," I replied evenly. "It was protection." My father looked between us confused. "What kind of account?" My mother's face had gone pale. I realized something in that moment. They didn't just underestimate my wealth, they didn't even know it existed. I had never told them the scale of what I built, not because I was hiding, but because I learned early on that transparency invites commentary, and commentary from insecure people turns into sabotage. So I kept it quiet. While they debated small promotions and mortgage rates, I was acquiring distressed assets in 3 countries. While they joked about my online thing, I was negotiating equity stakes behind NDAs. But in their narrative, I was the quiet one, the safe one, the non-threatening one. "Explain," my father demanded. My sister hesitated. Her husband tried again to steer control. "It's a business dispute, that's all." I stood slowly. "No," I said calmly, "it's a breach of trust." The room went silent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "They accessed a restricted financial layer under false pretenses. They used it as collateral. When the system detected unauthorized regeneration, it recovered assets and triggered compliance review." Blank stares. My aunt blinked. "What does that mean in English?" "It means," I said softly, never breaking eye contact with my sister, "they took something that wasn't theirs." The tension became suffocating. My mother looked at my sister. "Is that true?" Tears spilled now. "Yes." A single word, heavy, final. My father's face hardened in a way I hadn't seen in years. "You stole from your own sister?" "It wasn't stealing," her husband snapped. "It was temporary leverage." "Without permission," I added quietly. Phones buzzed again, multiple notifications this time. The audit had expanded. Because here's what they didn't anticipate. When compliance sees unusual leverage patterns tied to startup valuations, it doesn't just review the transaction, it reviews the books. And if the books don't match public claims, investors get nervous, very nervous. His phone rang again, different tone this time. Investor ID. He stared at it like it was a bomb about to detonate. "Answer it," I said gently. He did. I watched his composure disintegrate in real time. "No, we have liquidity." Pause. "It's temporary." Longer pause. "No, do not pull funding." Click. He lowered the phone slowly. "They're suspending," he said hoarsely. My sister gasped, because now this wasn't about my little account. This was about their entire operation. My father stood abruptly. "I can't believe this," he muttered. My mother looked heartbroken, not at me, at the illusion collapsing in front of her. Thanksgiving had turned into a financial autopsy, and I hadn't even revealed everything yet, because what the audit was uncovering wasn't just reckless leverage, it was inflated reporting, numbers rounded optimistically, valuations stretched beyond reality, and if regulators followed the trail far enough, this wouldn't stay a family matter. My sister looked at me through tears. "Please," she whispered, "call it off." I held her gaze. "I can't," I said quietly. "It's automated," which was true, mostly. Automation is a powerful shield. It removes emotion from enforcement. Her husband slammed his hand lightly against the table. "You could stop it if you wanted to." Could I? Perhaps. At a cost that would teach my boundaries were flexible, and I had spent 7 years making sure they weren't. The room felt smaller, colder. My mother sank back into her chair. My father looked 10 years older, and I realized something painful. No matter how justified I was, this would change everything. Family dynamics don't survive exposure easily, but neither does hidden resentment. Another notification lit up my phone. This one wasn't from compliance. It was from a regulatory oversight contact. Preliminary review initiated. I inhaled slowly because that meant this was escalating beyond internal damage control. This was becoming external, public, potentially irreversible. I looked up at my sister one last time, and I said the words that shifted the atmosphere completely. "It's not just about the money anymore." Her face crumpled. "What does that mean?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately because the truth was heavier than the silence. And when I finally spoke, the entire table froze.
The room froze. Her question hung like smoke from the candles. What does that mean? I looked around at the family I once trusted blindly, the people who had shared my childhood, my holidays, my secrets. They had assumed my quietness equaled weakness, that my success was small, that my little account was insignificant. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I took a deliberate breath. "It means," I said slowly, "that your actions have triggered external audits, investor alarms, and regulatory attention. It's no longer contained within this house, this Thanksgiving dinner, or even this family. It has started moving through the system on its own." My sister's hand trembled over her plate. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her husband's face had turned pale, lips pressed tight. My parents sat rigid, trying to parse the weight of the words. "I didn't plan for this," I continued, "but your decisions forced my hand. You used unauthorized access, you manipulated leverage, and you didn't think I'd notice. But I did, every step of the way." Silence. Heavy. Dense. And then came the first subtle quake. My sister's husband muttered under his breath, "This can't be happening. None of this makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," I said, softer but colder than ice. "You gambled with assets you didn't understand, underestimating the person you thought was powerless, and now the system is correcting itself." My mother covered her mouth, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. My father's hands clenched on the table edge. "This," I said, gesturing to the table, the living room, the family gathered around me, "isn't just money. It's respect. And when you take what isn't yours, there's always a cost." The notifications didn't stop. Margin calls, automated reversals, alerts from regulators, investor letters flagged for urgent attention. I watched silently as their little empire unraveled in real time. And through it all, I remained seated, calm, almost meditative. Because I had designed it that way. I had built the little account as a decoy, a layer of protection, a test of loyalty, a signal detector. When someone touched it without permission, it didn't just alert me. It activated a chain reaction I had mapped years ago. Every unauthorized move triggered contingency protocols. Every misstep amplified the consequences. It was a spider web, and they had stepped right into the center. My sister finally whispered, "Why are you doing this?" I tilted my head. "Because you forced me to. You chose betrayal. I chose protection." Her husband scoffed, shaking his head. "This is insane. We're family. You're ruining everything." Ruin. Funny word. To me, it meant exposure, accountability, truth, and maybe, finally, boundaries. "I'm not ruining anything," I said evenly. "You did. You crossed a line you didn't understand existed, and now you're seeing the consequences." He looked like he might shout, but before he could, another notification arrived on his phone. His eyes widened, hands trembling. "Wait, what?" he muttered, scrolling furiously. I didn't need to see the screen. I already knew. My systems had identified secondary exposure, unintended by them, but inevitable given how they structured the leverage. Their personal accounts were flagged, their startup holdings frozen, and investor funds on temporary hold. I watched the panic build in real time. My sister's voice cracked. "Please, please stop this. We didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to, but you did," I interrupted gently. Intent isn't a race action. She sank into her chair, covering her face. Her husband ran a hand through her hair, muttering curses under his breath. My parents were silent, shock-stricken. realizing that this wasn't just an argument or a family dispute. This was a reckoning. I leaned back slightly, letting the tension sit, watching, observing, every flicker of guilt, fear, and disbelief, every glance at phones, at screens, at dashboards they barely understood. Because this was the power of anticipation. You never need to raise your voice if you let consequences speak for you. By 4:30 p.m., the external alerts had escalated. Regulators were already reviewing the collateral trail. Investor inquiries demanded explanations. The audit team had flagged multiple irregularities in their filings. And through it all, my phone kept buzzing. Each notification another layer of controlled chaos. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction because they had been caught in the act, and sorrow because family dynamics rarely survive exposure this extreme. But boundaries, once crossed, cannot remain invisible. My sister whispered, barely audible. I thought you wouldn't notice. You were wrong, I said. Simple, absolute. Her husband's voice rose, panicked. This isn't over. You can't do this to us. I leaned forward. I already have. And in that moment, I realized that the calm I had maintained for hours was actually a weapon. Observation, silence, and controlled detachment had created a pressure that even their panic couldn't withstand. By 5 p.m., the collapse was undeniable. The leverage that they had attempted to manipulate were now frozen. Their investors were demanding immediate audits. Regulatory compliance teams were contacting legal counsel. And my little account, the one they had thought was insignificant, had done exactly what it was supposed to do: protect me while exposing the threat. I watched my sister's hands shake as she stared at her phone. She couldn't speak. Her husband leaned against the wall, head in hands, whispering curses. My parents were silent, shock-stricken, realizing that this wasn't just an argument or a family dispute. This was a reckoning. I leaned back slightly, letting the tension sit, watching, observing, every flicker of guilt, fear, and disbelief, every glance at phones, at screens, at dashboards they barely understood. Because this was the power of anticipation. You never need to raise your voice if you let consequences speak for you. By 4:30 p.m., the external alerts had escalated. Regulators were regulating their collateral trail. Investor inquiries demanded explanations. The audit team had flagged multiple irregularities in their filings. And through it all, my phone kept buzzing. Each notification another layer of controlled chaos. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction because they had been caught in the act, and sorrow because family dynamics rarely survive exposure this extreme. But boundaries, once crossed, cannot remain invisible. My sister whispered, barely audible. I thought you wouldn't notice. You were wrong, I said. Simple, absolute. Her husband's voice rose, panicked. This isn't over. You can't do this to us. I leaned forward. I already have. And in that moment, I realized that the calm I had maintained for hours was actually a weapon. Observation, silence, and controlled detachment had created a pressure that even their panic couldn't withstand. By 5 p.m., the collapse was undeniable. The leverage that they had attempted to manipulate were now frozen. Their investors were demanding immediate audits. Regulatory compliance teams were contacting legal counsel. And my little account, the one they had thought was insignificant, had done exactly what it was supposed to do: protect me while exposing the threat. I watched my sister's hands shake as she stared at her phone. She couldn't speak. Her husband leaned against the wall, head in hands, whispering curses. My parents, usually mediators and protectors, seemed paralyzed. Even they could not soften the impact of the systems I had built, the mechanisms I had put in place to detect and respond to betrayal. And still, I remained calm, because in moments like this, emotion is the enemy of strategy. I finally spoke, my voice low but clear. Everything you did was calculated. So was my response. The difference is that I planned for failure. You planned for greed. Her husband looked up, disbelief etched across his face. You planned for this? I planned for the possibility of your betrayal, I said, which is why you triggered an automated sequence designed to protect my assets, evaluate your intent, and escalate consequences. You underestimated me, and now you are facing the result. Her eyes welled with tears. But it's Thanksgiving. I let that sink in. Yes, the day you chose to betray, I chose to respond. And then, almost imperceptibly, I smiled. Not cruelly, not vindictively, but with clarity. Because for the first time, they saw me for who I really was. Not the quiet sister, not the small entrepreneur, not the cute little account owner, but the one who builds systems, who anticipates betrayal, who protects what is hers, and the one who does not forgive carelessness, especially from family. The day continued, seemingly ordinary from the outside. Turkey carved, mashed potatoes passed, laughter forced into the room. But beneath the surface, the family had shifted irreversibly. The leverage they had manipulated, the accounts they had accessed without permission, and the trust they had shattered, all had consequences beyond their immediate understanding. By nightfall, the audit trail was fully active. Regulators were reviewing their moves. Investors were pausing all new transactions. And the fallout of that morning's actions was far from over. I cleaned my plate quietly, observing the tension. The family had been forced to confront reality, and reality, in my world, had teeth. At 10 p.m., after everyone had left or retreated to their rooms, I sat alone with my laptop. The dashboards displayed the complete reversal and recovery. Every dollar accounted for, every unauthorized move traced, every exposure mitigated. I leaned back slightly, exhausted but relieved, because they had underestimated me, because they had assumed my silence was weakness, and because they had forgotten the most important rule. You can betray someone quietly, but consequences have no volume. They arrive precisely when and how they are meant to.
By the early hours of the next morning, the house was quiet. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic reminded me that life outside our little drama continued. I sat at my laptop, reviewing the final reports from the audit system. Every transaction, every leveraged move, every unauthorized attempt, they were all logged, time-stamped, and analyzed. It was beautiful in its precision. I thought about my sister and her husband, and a pang of sorrow hit me. Betrayal wasn't new to my family. There had been minor infractions before, misunderstandings, petty deceptions, even financial gambles, but nothing like this. Nothing that reached into my carefully constructed empire and tested its boundaries. They had chosen this path, and now they had to face the reality of their choices. The day began again with the usual routines: coffee brewing, my mother humming in the kitchen, birds singing outside the window. I wondered if she suspected the storm that had passed the night before, or if she still believed in the illusion of normalcy. She did not see what I saw: the cracks forming in my sister's confidence, the weight pressing down on her husband, the unspoken tension my parents carried. Power is often silent, and silence in the presence of misjudged actions can be louder than a shout. By mid-morning, notifications started coming in again. External investors had begun requesting explanations. Some were polite, some aggressive. Regulators flagged the leveraged vehicle for review. Emails piled up. Phone calls from compliance officers confirmed that all unauthorized transactions had been reversed and additional safeguards implemented. I sat back and allowed myself a slow breath. Each alert confirmed what I already knew. My systems were effective, and my family's underestimation had become their undoing. And yet, there was something deeper than satisfaction here. It was the knowledge that trust, once broken, could not be restored simply by apology. Later, my sister approached me in the living room. Her eyes were red, her hands fidgeting nervously. I didn't think it would escalate like this," she whispered, almost to herself. I regarded her carefully. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said softly. "You were wrong. And this isn't just about money. It's about boundaries, integrity, and respect." She flinched. That flinch, I realized, was the beginning of awareness. Her husband watched from the hallway, silent. He had no words. His usual bravado had dissolved into helplessness. I took a moment to explain calmly what had happened. "You accessed a restricted financial layer that triggered a series of automated protocols designed to protect assets and assess intent. Every action you took outside authorized access was monitored, traced, and eventually corrected. It wasn't personal. It was methodical. And it worked." She gasped softly. "So we could have lost everything?" "You did lose control," I said, "but not everything. That is because I designed my systems with foresight and resilience. If I had not anticipated betrayal, even from someone I love, you would have caused irreparable damage." She fell silent. The reality of her actions, the exposure, the accountability, the looming external scrutiny, was beginning to sink in. By afternoon, the family was tentative. Conversations were clipped. Eyes avoided mine. My parents struggled to maintain neutrality, balancing loyalty to their children with acknowledgement of the facts. And through all of this, I remained calm, because this is the nature of power. The person who controls information, timing, and consequences rarely needs to raise their voice. The lessons my sister and her husband were learning could not be taught gently. They required experience, and experience demanded impact. I stepped into the office to review further data. The leveraged instruments had fully reversed. Investor accounts had been updated. Notifications to regulatory bodies confirmed compliance. And the little account, the one that had started it all, was restored to its full capacity, untouched and fully secured. I leaned back and reflected. 7 years of careful planning, countless hours of strategy, simulations, and security layering. And all of it had been tested, not by an external competitor, but by my own family. It was painful, but it was also a testament to resilience. Later that evening, my sister approached me again. Her voice was quieter, more reflective. I understand now," she said, almost hesitantly. "I didn't realize how serious this was." I studied her face. The fear was still there, but mixed with comprehension. The lesson had been delivered, not through anger, not through shouting, but through consequence. "You underestimated me," I said, "not because I wanted to hide, but because you didn't consider my capabilities. That was your mistake." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." Her husband remained silent, glancing at me with a mixture of awe, fear, and perhaps the first spark of respect. The night settled over the house, quiet now, reflective. I sat alone in the study, looking at the dashboards one final time for the day. Everything was back to normal. Everything was accounted for. And yet the events of the day left an imprint deeper than numbers. Betrayal is rarely about money alone. It's about trust. It's about assumption. It's about testing the limits of someone you believe will not respond. And when those limits are tested, the response is rarely forgotten. By bedtime, the house was silent.
Everyone retreated to their rooms, carrying the weight of the day. My sister and her husband had learned lessons that could not be undone. My parents had witnessed the hidden architecture of my world, and I sat quietly, reflecting on the layers of protection I had built, not just for wealth, but for myself. In the quiet, I allowed a small smile, because they had underestimated me, because they had assumed my silence was weakness, and because now, they, and perhaps the entire family, understood that even the smallest account can hide the greatest empire. The day ended not with forgiveness, but with awareness, not with reconciliation, but with understanding, not with tears alone, but with the unshakable truth that actions have consequences, and boundaries, once crossed, demand reckoning. And in that quiet house, on the night after a Thanksgiving filled with hidden treachery, I finally felt a strange sense of closure.
The morning after Thanksgiving felt deceptively normal. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counters, birds chirped outside, and the smell of coffee drifted through the air. But the house was different. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken words. Every glance, every movement carried the weight of yesterday's revelations. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked to the porch. The air was crisp, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe. The systems I had built had worked perfectly. The leveraged instruments had been reversed, the unauthorized access neutralized, and the audit trail was clean. But calm didn't erase the lingering anxiety in the house. My sister and her husband moved silently, almost as if walking on glass. My parents avoided eye contact, caught between concern and shock. And yet, in that quiet, I noticed something subtle, a shift in the balance of power. By 10 a.m., emails from external auditors had begun arriving. Investors wanted confirmations, explanations, and assurances. Regulators flagged a few items for follow-up. It was procedural, but each alert was a subtle reminder. Yesterday's actions were no longer private. I opened the primary dashboard and ran a quick analysis. Everything was contained. The exposure had been reversed and mitigated. My assets were secure. And yet I knew that the real lesson wasn't in the money. It was in control. Control is the ultimate currency, and yesterday I had regained it completely. My sister approached, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes avoided mine. We need to talk, she whispered, voice trembling. I nodded. Yes, we do. We sat in the study, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the computer. She swallowed hard. I don't know how to apologize for what we did. I thought it was temporary. I didn't think it would escalate like this. I listened, letting her words hang in the air. Intent isn't the same as permission, I said finally. You acted without authorization. You took risks that weren't yours to take, and you assumed I wouldn't notice. Her eyes filled with tears. We didn't mean to hurt you. Perhaps not intentionally, I said softly, but hurt was inevitable when trust is broken. Her husband joined the conversation reluctantly, pacing the room. We thought we were helping, he said, frustration and panic rising in his voice. We just needed temporary leverage for the investors, nothing else. I leaned back in my chair. Temporary leverage? You regenerated an access key, bypassed restrictions, and exposed yourself to personal liability. This wasn't temporary, it was reckless, and your lack of foresight has consequences beyond your understanding. He stopped pacing, suddenly aware of the weight of the words. Consequences? How bad are they? I let the silence speak. Sometimes silence communicates more effectively than explanation. I reflected on the architecture I had built. Every layer of protection, every contingency plan, every stress test scenario, all of it had been designed to detect anomalies, assess intent, and respond automatically. I had anticipated internal threats because experience had taught me that sometimes betrayal comes not from competitors, but from those closest to you. They had underestimated that, and yesterday they had learned the hard way. By noon, notifications indicated that the external audits were intensifying. Investors were scrutinizing every move. Regulatory reviews had expanded slightly to cover indirect exposure. My sister and her husband were receiving letters, phone calls, and emails, each one a reminder of yesterday's choices. I watched their reactions silently, noting the tension, the panic, the disbelief. They believed the little account was harmless, that I was harmless, and that my silence equated to weakness. It didn't. And now the consequences were unfolding exactly as I anticipated. Later in the afternoon, my sister finally spoke with clarity. We never realized the scale of what we were touching, she said, voice low, almost a whisper. I thought it was just money in a little account. I didn't know it was part of something bigger. I said, you assumed incorrectly. The account was a visible layer, a decoy. The real value, the real infrastructure was deeper, protected, monitored, and capable of recovering from unauthorized actions. You didn't just touch money, you touched a system designed to respond intelligently to threats. Her husband's face paled. You mean everything that happened yesterday was automatic? Mostly, but it was triggered by your actions. The system didn't invent the problem, it responded to the risk you introduced. He sank into a chair, head in his hands, finally grasping the gravity of the situation. Even my parents, who had tried to remain neutral, couldn't hide their surprise. We had no idea, my mother said softly. We thought you were just quiet, careful, yes, but not this. I nodded. Quiet does not mean powerless. Careful does not mean incapable, and underestimated does not mean irrelevant. Yesterday proved all of that. The room was heavy with tension, introspection, and unspoken understanding. They had witnessed a quiet force at work, a response that was methodical, precise, and inevitable. And now they had to reconcile that their assumptions about me were wrong. By evening, the external alerts had settled. The audit trail was secure, compliance reports filed, and investor concerns addressed. Everything had returned to a state of equilibrium, but the family dynamics had shifted irreversibly. I watched my sister as she quietly packed her laptop, preparing to work from home for the next few days while the regulatory review continued. There was humility in her posture, but also a lingering fear that crossed into respect, a recognition of boundaries she had ignored. Her husband remained quiet, observing, processing, and perhaps beginning to understand the complexity of the systems he had challenged. I realized then that the real victory wasn't financial, it was psychological. They had tested me, they had triggered systems they didn't understand, they had attempted to manipulate what they assumed was trivial, and in doing so, they had revealed themselves to me and themselves to reality. Power is not aggression, it's preparation, anticipation, and the ability to respond with precision when others miscalculate. And yesterday, that principle had been demonstrated flawlessly. As night fell, the house quieted. I reviewed the dashboards one last time, confirming that all exposures were mitigated, all assets secure, and all notifications resolved. The little account, the account they underestimated, stood intact, a symbol of foresight, planning, and resilience. I leaned back, exhausted, but satisfied. The lesson had been delivered, the system had worked, and the family had been forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Betrayal had been met with response, risk had been met with mitigation, and underestimation had been met with proof. I finally allowed myself to smile. Not in cruelty, not in vengeance, but in quiet understanding, because they had learned a truth that could not be ignored. Power is not always loud, control is not always visible, and the smallest, most underestimated layer can hold the mightiest force. And in the aftermath of Thanksgiving, amidst the quiet and the tension, that lesson had been made painfully clear.
The next morning, I woke to an unusual quiet. The house felt smaller, heavier, charged with the aftermath of betrayal and exposure. The usual hum of daily life, coffee brewing, birds outside, distant traffic, was present, but muted. The tension from the day before hadn't dissipated. It had only become more palpable, like the calm before another storm. I knew it wouldn't be long before the consequences fully landed.
My sister and her husband were still processing the magnitude of what had happened. My parents, meanwhile, were silent observers, caught between protecting their children and acknowledging the truth they hadn't wanted to see. And I was ready. By 9 a.m., I had already checked every dashboard, every alert, every notification. Everything was stable, but stability doesn't mean safety. In situations like this, complacency can be fatal. I remembered the exact moment I realized how deep the breach had gone. The secondary exposure, the hidden leverages they didn't know they were activating, had caused external investors to pause transactions. Regulators had begun reviewing associated entities, and the audit system had automatically flagged connections I hadn't initially intended to reveal. It was a cascade, and now the full weight of that cascade was about to hit them. My sister approached me first, hesitant, almost afraid. We need to talk about what's next, she whispered, voice trembling. I nodded slowly. Yes, we do, and it's going to be difficult. Her husband appeared behind her, trying to mask panic with forced composure. We're going to fix this. Everything will be fine, he said, but his voice betrayed him. I let them speak, giving them a false sense of control. It was important they underestimated the calm before the next wave, because they didn't understand the final layer. The system I had built years ago wasn't just reactive, it was anticipatory. Every unauthorized action, every breach, every attempt at manipulation was logged and analyzed. And if certain thresholds were reached, it didn't just stop at recovery, it escalated consequences. Yesterday had triggered the first wave. Today, the secondary consequences would surface, and this time they couldn't be reversed. By 11 a.m., emails began arriving, not from investors, not from regulators, but from associated entities they had tied to their leverage. Contracts flagged for review, holdings frozen, margin requirements increased, and because they had assumed they could manipulate the system without understanding the architecture, the dominoes were falling exactly as designed. I watched their reactions carefully. My sister's face went pale when her phone buzzed. Her husband's hand shook as he scrolled through notifications. And my parents, they finally realized the full scale of what had been set into motion. I approached them quietly. You need to understand, I said softly. The system doesn't punish recklessly. It corrects intelligently. But when the threshold of miscalculation is crossed, consequences aren't optional. Her husband glared at me. You could stop this. I shook my head slowly. Not without compromising the integrity of the architecture. And you forced my hand. My sister's voice trembled. We didn't think. You didn't think, I interrupted. And that is why you are facing the consequences. Every misstep has been anticipated. Every reckless move logged. Every breach corrected. And now the final layer has activated. At 12:30 p.m., the full escalation began. The secondary exposure previously contained triggered external audits of their investor reports. Regulatory compliance reviews intensified. Margin calls on their leveraged positions increased. And the automated system began tracing all related entities back to their personal holdings. I watched as panic spread across their faces. Emails, calls, notifications, they couldn't keep up. Every attempt to intervene only escalated the consequences. My sister fell into a chair, hands covering her face. Please stop this, she whispered, almost inaudibly. I knelt slightly to meet her eyes. I can't stop something that was triggered by your actions. You chose to breach trust. You chose to manipulate access. You chose to underestimate me. And now you are experiencing the full consequences. Her husband's face went ashen. This will ruin everything, he muttered. I leaned back, calm, deliberate. It will only reveal what you were unwilling to understand. Control, foresight, and boundaries aren't optional. You crossed the line. The house felt claustrophobic, heavy with tension. Every sound, every vibration, every notification carried weight. The system had escalated far beyond what they could control. Every attempt to intervene manually triggered further alerts, exposing additional vulnerabilities. By 1:15 p.m., the reality hit them fully. External investors were contacting auditors directly. Regulatory bodies were flagging multiple irregularities. Their personal guarantees were under scrutiny. And all of it was traceable, documented, and irreversible. I remained calm. I watched. I observed. Because chaos, when designed and anticipated, becomes a tool of clarity. Finally, the system sent a notification I had been waiting for. Full recovery confirmed. Assets restored. Unauthorized actions traced and neutralized. Secondary exposure contained. And the people responsible, my sister and her husband, had been forced to confront the scale of their misjudgment. I looked at them both. Silence hung between us. No words could undo what had been done. No apology could reverse the chain of events. You understand now, I said softly. Her sister's eyes brimmed with tears. Yes, she whispered. We understand. Her husband remained silent, processing the magnitude of the events. My parents finally realized the depth of what had occurred.
They had been spectators to the collapse triggered by those they trusted most. By mid-afternoon, the automated escalation had done its work. Investor confidence had been shaken. Regulatory scrutiny had intensified. Margin calls had been enforced. Holdings were frozen. And all of it was traceable, documented, and irreversible. I remained calm. I watched. I observed. Because chaos, when designed and anticipated, becomes a tool of clarity. Finally, the system sent a notification I had been waiting for. Full recovery confirmed. Assets restored. Unauthorized actions traced and neutralized. Secondary exposure contained. And the people responsible, my sister and her husband, had been forced to confront the scale of their misjudgment. I looked at them both. Silence hung between us. No words could undo what had been done. No apology could reverse the chain of events. You understand now, I said softly. Her sister's eyes brimmed with tears. Yes, we understand. Her husband remained silent, processing the magnitude of the events. By mid-afternoon, the automated escalation had done its work. Investor confidence had been shaken. Regulatory scrutiny had intensified. Margin calls had been enforced. Holdings were frozen. And all of it was traceable, documented, and irreversible. I remained calm. I watched. I observed. Because chaos, when designed and anticipated, becomes a tool of clarity. Finally, the system sent a notification I had been waiting for. Full recovery confirmed. Full recovery confirmed. Assets restored. Unauthorized actions traced and neutralized. Secondary exposure contained. And the people responsible, my sister and her husband, had been forced to confront the scale of their misjudgment. I looked at them both. Silence hung between us. No words could undo what had been done. No apology could reverse the chain of events. You understand now, I said softly. Her sister's eyes brimmed with tears. Yes, we understand. Her husband remained silent. Her husband remained silent, processing the magnitude of the events. By mid-afternoon, the automated escalation had done its work. Investor confidence had been shaken.
The house was eerily silent the morning after the final escalation. Thanksgiving had passed, but its aftermath lingered like smoke, curling into every corner. My sister and her husband had retreated to separate rooms, each absorbed in their own anxiety and disbelief. My parents moved quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone, as though the weight of what had occurred required physical distance to process. I walked through the house slowly, letting my presence be felt without words. Power doesn't always announce itself. It radiates quietly, methodically, through observation and precision. Yesterday had been the proof. Today, the reckoning was settling into reality. I returned to my study, where the dashboards glowed softly in the dim morning light. Every metric confirmed what I already knew. The little account was intact, secure, and fully recovered. All unauthorized actions had been reversed. Secondary exposure had been neutralized. Investor confidence was stabilizing. And the system, the network I had spent years designing, had done exactly what it was meant to do. Yet, despite the numerical clarity, I felt a deeper sense of reflection. Betrayal isn't measured in dollars alone. It's measured in trust, in assumptions, in the small, insidious ways people test your boundaries. And when those boundaries are crossed, consequences are inevitable. By late morning, my sister approached me. Her steps were hesitant, each one heavy with the weight of understanding. She stopped just outside my study and spoke quietly, almost as if afraid her words might shatter the fragile calm. We didn't understand, she said, voice trembling. I thought it was just a small account. I didn't know it was part of something bigger. I didn't know how serious this could get. I regarded her calmly. You assumed my silence was weakness. You assumed my discretion meant incapacity. You assumed you could manipulate without oversight. All of those assumptions were incorrect. Tears welled in her eyes. We didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. Intent does not erase consequence, I replied softly. You acted recklessly. You underestimated me, and the results speak for themselves. Her husband appeared in the doorway, hesitant, hands shaking. We thought we were helping, he said, voice strained. We just wanted to show investors temporary stability, nothing else. I didn't flinch. Temporary stability does not justify bypassing restrictions or regenerating access keys. You triggered a chain reaction, automated, methodical, and irreversible. You are experiencing the consequences because you crossed a boundary you didn't understand existed. He slumped into a chair, silence falling between us. My sister's head hung low. My parents watched quietly, the weight of the lessons settling on all of them. The system I had built years ago wasn't just reactive, it was anticipatory. Every unauthorized move, every breach, every misstep had been logged, analyzed, and responded to automatically. It wasn't about punishment, it was about correction. When thresholds were crossed, escalation was inevitable. Yesterday had been the first wave. Today, the secondary and tertiary consequences had fully manifested. And now the lessons were clear.
Underestimate me at your own peril. By afternoon, external notifications had begun to slow. Investors were reassured, regulatory concerns addressed. Audit trails were documented and secure. The house, once tense with immediate panic, had become a space of quiet reflection. The emotional impact, however, was far from resolved. I walked through the living room, observing my family. My sister and her husband sat quietly, heads bowed, the weight of yesterday's events etched into their expressions. My parents exchanged looks that communicated both worry and reluctant respect. And I realized something profound. The lesson had been delivered not through confrontation, but through consequence. I sat down beside my sister. "You need to understand something important," I said gently. "Betrayal isn't only about the act itself. It's about trust. It's about assumptions. And it's about boundaries. When those are violated, the response must be proportionate, deliberate, and inevitable." She looked up, eyes glistening. I understand now," she whispered. "I see what we did. I see how much we underestimated you." "Yes," I said. "And that understanding is the first step toward accountability. It doesn't erase what happened, but it ensures it won't happen again." Her husband remained silent, processing the implications, the depth of the systems he had unknowingly challenged, and the precision of the response he had triggered. As evening approached, I reflected on the broader lesson. The little account had been more than money. It had been a test, a protective layer, a signal detector. Its apparent insignificance had been deliberate, designed to reveal intent and measure reaction. When challenged, it responded with precision, exposing risks and correcting breaches. Power, I realized, isn't always loud. Control isn't always visible. And even the smallest, most underestimated layer can hold the greatest force. By nightfall, the family had gathered quietly for a modest dinner. The air was still heavy, but calmer. My sister and her husband had begun to process their mistakes. My parents had come to terms with the reality that underestimation could have dangerous consequences. And I had confirmed once again that foresight, preparation, and measured response are the truest forms of protection. I observed them all carefully. Silence spoke volumes. Reflection replaced panic. And subtle respect began to emerge from the cracks of yesterday's chaos. I realized then that the ultimate lesson wasn't financial. It wasn't even about revenge or justice. It was about awareness, about understanding limits, boundaries, and consequences, about recognizing that underestimation can have profound repercussions, and about accepting that actions, intentional or not, carry weight far beyond the immediate moment. Betrayal is inevitable in human relationships, especially when ambition, entitlement, and misjudgment intersect. But response, that measured, deliberate, and proportionate response, is what defines strength. As evening approached, I retreated to my study once more. The dashboards were quiet now, the alerts resolved, the system secure. I allowed myself a moment of reflection. 7 years of planning, anticipation, and foresight had been tested, and the architecture I had built, the layers of protection and detection, had proven flawless. But the true victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the understanding. The recognition from my family that my discretion was not weakness, my quietness was not incapacity, and my little account was far more than it appeared. I leaned back, exhausted but resolved. The lessons had been delivered, the consequences executed, and the family had been forced to confront reality, not through anger, not through force, but through the inevitable unfolding of their own choices. Betrayal had been met with response, recklessness with precision, underestimation with undeniable proof, and in the quiet of the night, I finally allowed myself to feel closure. The moral was clear. Never underestimate the quiet, the careful, or the unnoticed. Those who appear small may have built empires in secret. Those who seem silent may have prepared for storms. And those who respect boundaries, foresight, and strategy will always prevail when others test them. The little account was more than a financial layer. It was a lesson, a revelation, a testament to preparation, discipline, and the power of anticipating betrayal before it arrives. And as I finally turned off the laptop, the house quiet around me, I understood this truth deeply. The strongest lessons are rarely taught in anger. They are revealed through consequence, precision, and unwavering control.